What is SPELLHANCE Shaman? This is a variation of your traditional enhancement shaman, just with some subtle differences. But these subtle differences in the way you gear and play this version of enhancement can add up to be quite a big damage difference, especially for the first few tiers of Wrath of the Lich King. Stick around for this video where I'll be discussing what makes SPELLHANCE different and why it's so strong in the early tiers of Wrath of the Lich King. And if you like this content, I would appreciate it if you hit that like and sub button. And without further ado, let's jump right into the video. What's interesting about SPELLHANCE is this build wasn't actually played or really thought of back when Wrath was actually live. It was actually created more recently within the Wrath of the Lich King private server scene. So I'm very excited to try and bring this to Wrath Classic. So the difference between your traditional Enhanced Shaman and SPELLHANCE is actually quite subtle, as I mentioned earlier. Enhance already has a good mixture of physical and magic damage. However, in the early raid tiers of Wrath of the Lich King, you tend to see magical damage based classes to do a little bit better than their physical damage counterparts. This is mostly due to the lack of early armor pen gear that drops from the first few raid tiers, but physical damage builds definitely get a lot better later on once they start seeing some more armor pen. And this is where really SPELLHANCE comes into play. Traditionally, you'll want to stack your normal male agi gear with attack power on Enhance, but since the spec can make full use of using spells and spell power, why not just pump up the magic damage aspect of the spec rather than going all in on the attack power? And since magic damage does tend to do a little bit better in the first few raid tiers, as I mentioned earlier, this does lead to a better DPS performance. And that's exactly what SPELLHANCE sets out to do, to increase that magical damage output while still being melee. One thing to note about SPELLHANCE is it does tend to fall off in the later raid tiers of Wrath of the Lich King, like I said, when physical damage becomes a lot better. So for the early tiers, you might want to try SPELLHANCE, and then when the tiers roll out, you might want to switch back into the traditional Enhanced Shaman. So let's talk about the gearing difference with SPELLHANCE Shaman. You'll still want to go after your pre-bis attack power gear for all of your main slots, but the big difference here is you're going to want to grab all the spell power accessories, rings, trinkets that you can. Grabbing a spell power one-handed weapon is also a totally viable thing for SPELLHANCE to do. As an example, in the Wrath of the Lich King pre-patch, I have been using this Shard of Contempt trinket, and if you know anything about this trinket, it's that every single melee DPS in the game right now currently wants it. But for my second trinket, I've been using Timbal's Focusing Crystal, which actually does proc with my Flame Shock and has a good amount of spell power on it. I actually really like this trinket on Enhance, and I have been seeing some pretty solid DPS with it. This is just sort of an example of trinkets and, accessories with spell power that you could possibly run with SPELLHANCE. Now, enhancement innately benefits a lot from both spell power and attack power from all these different off pieces, so this does theoretically make it way easier to gear up as well. But just try not to get too greedy and need on every single off piece that drops. You'll really want to focus on spell power here, but if nobody needs an attack power off piece and you still need an upgrade, it's still a viable thing to go after. So for talents, you're actually going to want to go for the build that puts emphasis on your fire totems with talents like Elemental Fury and Improved Fire Nova. This is both for single and AoE damage, as Fire Nova will make up a good portion of your damage. For your glyphs, you're going to want to take Glyph of Fire Nova and Glyph of Flame Tongue Weapon. The Flame Tongue Weapon glyph is actually pretty big as it adds 2% spell crit per weapon. So you can double Flame Tongue Weapon for 4% spell crit and is actually completely viable. But for my preference, I do like to put Flame Tongue Weapon on my offhand weapon and Wind Fury Weapon on my main hand. For the third glyph, I like to take Glyph of Lightning Shield as it adds 20% more damage to the ability, but Glyph of Storm Strike is also a very good option. For the rotation, there's a little bit of a subtle difference, and I'll go ahead and break it down here. Obviously, pre-pull, you're going to want to drop your totems, and when the fight starts, you're going to want to use your big cooldowns like your Fire Elemental and Feral Spirit. You're going to want to maintain and make sure you keep up your Lightning Shield and Flame Shock on the target. Your first priority is to make sure that Storm Strike is used on cooldown. Next on the list, you're going to want to dump your Maelstrom stacks at around 3 or 4 stacks on Lightning Bolt for single target damage or Chain Lightning for AoE. The reason you'll want to use it at around 3 or 4 stacks is to not overcap on the amount of Maelstrom procs you'll get and be as efficient as possible. You also want to make sure that when you do cast your Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning with your Maelstrom stacks that it does not clip with where your next auto attack will be. This is why using it at around 3 stacks might be much harder to time on your auto attacks, and the safer bet will probably be to use them at around 4 stacks. Next, you'll want to use Earth Shock on cooldown as long as Flame Shock does not need to be refreshed. Next, you're going to want to prioritize using your Magma Totem with the ability Fire Nova. Your Fire Totems actually scale with your spell power, which is what makes them so strong with SPELLHANCE. And then lastly, really as a last resort, you can use Lava Lash, but it's really not that great early on, especially for SPELLHANCE. I do believe Lava Lash does get a lot better as the raid tiers come out, and by that point you'll actually have, re-rolled back into a traditional enhancement shaman where it will actually overtake priority over Fire Nova and Magma Totem. So what's the key takeaway here? Well, really SPELLHANCE is just a little bit of a different way to think about and play enhancement shaman. The change isn't too crazy, but the subtle differences are what set it apart. You'll find that sometimes it's just better to use a spell power off piece rather than an attack power based one. Sometimes you'll find that the itemization with spell power gear is just better than attack power gear, especially during the first few raid tiers of Wrath of the Lich King. And with a SPELLHANCE mindset, that's totally okay. Whether you go full SPELLHANCE with all spell power off pieces, or you only run a couple spell power pieces because they're better than certain attack power ones you have, it's just a mindset, and all these subtle differences really do add up to make it feel like a different playstyle, like a kind of a different build for enhancement. And to me, that's just something I have a lot of fun with in Wrath of the Lich King in general. It's just finding these variations of these kind of niche off-meta builds that these different class specs have to offer. Thank you so much for watching this video, I really appreciate it. If you would like to see more World of Warcraft related content like this, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button, and I will see you all in the next video.